S.D. Boyan. This is the Doc with SilverDoctors.com. We're pleased to welcome back our good friend Ned Naylor-Leyland from Cheviot Asset Management. Welcome back, Ned.
Hi there, Doc. Nice to be with you.
Well, let's get started right away with the big story this week in gold. The German Federal Accountability Office ruled that the Bundesbank must repatriate and audit 150 tons of Germany's gold reserves from the New York Fed over the next 3 years. Obviously, 150 tons is just a small fraction of Germany's nearly 4,000-ton gold reserve, but it seems more significant to us on more of like a psychological standpoint and potentially triggering a loss of confidence in the system.
Sure, I think that's true. It's also, you've got to bear in mind that any physical which is removed from the fractionally backed system effectively unwinds leverage. So really, the 50-ton number is much larger in real terms in terms of the impact on the underlying market, Doc. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. The good news is that Germans generally don't let these kinds of things drop. Once they've got their teeth into something, they're likely to remain focused upon it. So, I'm very hopeful that this subject is going to become, more mainstream over the next few weeks.
You kind of touched on the fact that the 50 tons a year really, when you're talking about physical removal, is really could potentially move the market. And I kind of think back to 2011 when Hugo Chavez in Venezuela repatriated Venezuelan gold. I think it was around, correct me if I'm wrong, Ned, but like 100 tons or 120 tons. And now this is also at the same time frame as all the debt negotiations in the U.S., but we saw gold run from, I think, somewhere around 1,500 to 1,900 over that same time frame.
Yeah, that sounds to be about the right number. I can't claim to know the exact number, Doc, but I expect a similar effect. I think obviously the more important issue, though, is whether this spreads. I think we've seen some further comment from within Holland, although I think that's quite a relatively early stage development / story over there. But the key thing is that this particular subject becomes more widely understood and discussed. I mean, as you and I know, if you're holding your central bank gold reserves either in the Bank of England or in the New York Fed, you have as much chance, well, sorry, let me rephrase that, unless you are Theseus trying to find the Minotaur, you've got no chance of getting out of there with any metal. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be a really interesting 3 to 6 month period here where undoubtedly the subject has to evolve from its current, relatively early stage and become a much bigger deal.
Now, perhaps even more intriguing, previously classified report emerged several days after the initial German story that Germany actually has already withdrawn 1,000 tons of gold from the Bank of England from the years of 2000 to 2001, almost exactly coinciding with Brown's bottom when the Bank of England dumped about 400 tons of gold. Right, almost coinciding with the absolute lows in gold for the bear market. So I guess, what are your thoughts on the correlation of that? Could Germany's 1,000-ton repatriation request back in the early 2000s have played any role in Brown's bottom?
I'm sure, with the benefit of hindsight, Doc, it must have had a role. I think there were a number of things that were going on at that time that would have helped drive this change, but I think that it's certainly fair analysis to say that must have had a role in it. I think the interesting thing is the fact that they were doing that even so far back as 2000. I'm quite intrigued to know, the fact that they've come out with this information. I'm surprised they've come out with this information in the first place, if I'm honest. But the fact that they have, then the question should be, okay, well, what was the rationale to take such a large amount? They're now claiming they only want little bits just to check the quality and this, that, and the other. Well, in that case, why did they take delivery of such a large amount from London at that point? It does seem very interesting, and one can but hope that mainstream journalists will, want to ask these questions as well. And I think it's up to you, I, and the rest of the people in the sector to push the agenda.
There's been lots of rumors swirling around the markets that Germany may actually be the one to withdraw from the euro before any of the southern members, like, say, Spain or Greece. How critical would it be for Germany to actually physically have all of its gold reserves on hand, I guess, prior to setting up a new... I would imagine if they would withdraw from the euro and reinstate the Deutsche Mark, they would want it to be gold backed.
Well, I think it's an interesting point you make. I think the honest answer is, in my opinion, I don't think that would make much difference. I think if the Germans want to go back on the mark, I think it will be based on German productivity and German culture and German philosophy towards investment and saving, rather than the exact location of the gold reserves. You and I know that, in truth, this is very important, and it is important. I don't think that would sort of stop their ability to either go back on the mark or a new gold-plated version thereof. But clearly, if the gold isn't there at all, which I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. If the ownership chain of custody is severely tarnished and it's obvious that that's a problem, then I think that can certainly affect the valuation of a new currency unit, which might or might not be backed by physical. So the stories intertwine. At exactly what level they become one, I think, is a difficult thing to be clear about. And really, I think that we'll never get to the final bottom of unraveling the issues of gold custody, no matter how much things evolve back to where you and I want them to. I don't think we'll ever get to the absolute bottom of it. But I think that the fact the subject is now up for discussion in a way where it wasn't before is tremendously good news. I tell you what I did enjoy as well, Doc, was the language used. Forgive me if I've got this wrong. I think it was the Bundesbank's language, where they said, I think they said, we don't have the slightest doubt about our counterparty. Well, for me, if they weren't worried about it, they would use language along the lines of, we're comfortable, or, we know about this. But the way the language seemed slightly grasping, it was this, they described the Bank of England and the Fed in very sort of generous terms. Again, I can't remember the exact language, but they were being particularly complimentary about those two institutions, which is, of course, ridiculous. And the fact that they use that language, I think, tends to suggest that maybe this is more of a problem than it was a few weeks ago.
Right. For an exact quote, they said, "For years our gold has been stored by the highly esteemed central banks of the United States, Great Britain, and France without provoking any complaints whatsoever, not by just any fly-by-night operators. Part of the debate in Germany has veered somewhat towards the absurd." And I think also a little bit earlier in the statement, they said, "We have had nothing but the best of experiences with our partners in New York, London, and Paris. There was never any doubt about the security of Germany's gold. In the future, we wish to continue to keep gold at international gold trading centers."
Well, quite. I'm sure you feel the same as I do about this. The language is very good for you and I. It's very promising, I think, that they should sound so over the top when discussing what should be a rather banal issue. But it's clearly the case that they've been rattled on some level into saying some things which they probably shouldn't have said. It, again, slightly reminds me of that Blythe Masters interview where she stuff she shouldn't have said. And it seems to me like it's a firefighting exercise, which is, in light of what we know about the tightness of the physical market and, the lack of contango and all the things that one can see in the physical market, this is all playing into the idea that the pressure is on and it's not likely to dissipate.
And perhaps even more telling from their statements, they made the remarks that they're in negotiations with the Federal Reserve to set up some sort of auditing process. And that's just amazing to me that you have several thousand tons of gold reserves held at a central bank, in this case the New York Federal Reserve. It's been there for decades, and you have no auditing procedures set up, absolutely zero accountability.
Well, I suppose though, if you think about it, that arrangement was post-World War II, presumably. I mean, I'm guessing, to be fair, I don't know enough about this as I should, and I've been quite busy the last few days, but I think you'll find that this must relate in some way to Bretton Woods. So whatever sort of nod and handshake was agreed between the political establishment at that time would have been the prevailing wind behind this. So you're entirely right to make the point that it seems ridiculous it's not in place, but with the benefit of understanding how these things work on a political level, I'm not that shocked that there isn't an established procedure, particularly seeing as we know that central bank gold auditing is not something which exactly happens on a particularly regular or transparent basis anywhere. So I don't think the Germans they may say they're in negotiations. I can't think they're expecting a positive result with that anytime soon. So I suppose the issue for them is now, well, what on earth do we do about this? And the answer is not a lot. Unless they want to start borrowing. I think they made some comment about, it's convenient for them to have it in New York because they can borrow dollars as a result of having the collateral on the site. Well, I mean, first of all, that's absolutely bizarre. But, even if that's true, well, then fine. Borrow the money and buy the gold through the LBMA if you're worried about it like that. There are lots of ways this can evolve. I think it's going to be really interesting. But expecting anybody to go about any kind of audit at this point, I think, is wholly unrealistic.
And you'd kind of alluded to the fact, besides the German announcement, we've also, I'd say, over the past year and a half, we've seen initiatives in Venezuela has successfully repatriated their gold. Switzerland has, I believe, a citizens movement underway. You alluded to the Netherlands have a citizens movement in the early stages. We also saw a story this week that Romania is trying to get their gold reserves back from Russia. So we have a few different nations already attempting to audit and or repatriate their gold reserves. Ned, how do you see this playing out going forward? Do you see this spreading throughout the Western world? And are the Fed and the Bank of England in trouble?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt it's going to spread. The issue is it going to be visible, Doc? It's not that way. I think it's been spreading ever since Chavez did what he did. I'm sure that despite the sort of the tinge of comedy with which it was presented, which is always the case, anything to do with Venezuela in the Western media is always presented as being, I think you used the word absurd earlier, that would be the way it was tinged, but I'm sure it wasn't the case amongst some central bankers that weren't particularly up to speed with the subject. I'm sure that caught their attention. So I think there's no doubt that the subject is definitely live, but of course, like I sort of said to you earlier, I can't think that they realistically can expect a positive resolution of it. In other words, no one can really expect to be able to call up their counterparty and say, right, I want either a full exhaustive audit or full delivery of all of it immediately. I don't think either of those two things are in play. So I think the issue is simply one of the mainstream. Can this subject evolve from its current status to becoming a live subject? I think Ambrose Evans-Pritchard in the Daily Telegraph in the UK at least touched on the subject last week, which was a surprise to me because gold is not a subject he likes to write about very often. But I think it's more about, it's going to be happening in the background. The subject is now live. It's going to become more and more important. Whether or not it's taboo and too sensitive for discussion through the mainstream media is a different question and a difficult one for me to answer. But I think in terms of answering your question of, where's it going to go from here? Well, the pressure will continue to ratchet up. The importance of this subject will continue to grow. And as you and I well know, with an accelerating price point behind it, it will become that much more, relevant and spread as a conversation.
Before we let you go, Ned, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about Cheviot and where they can find out more information about your work?
Sure, of course. Well, the website of the business is www.cheviot.co.uk, which is CHEVIOT. In terms of what we do there, it's a regular private client asset management firm, but what might be of interest to some of the listeners is we have an interesting resource on there under the press banner on our website. If you look in there, you'll see a link to a Sound Money conference. We have the likes of James Turk and Hugo Salinas Price and John Butler and Sandeep Jaitley and people like that talking about sound money and drivers behind it. It's a free resource on our website, and I very much push people to have a look at that if they haven't had a chance already.
Oh, thanks, Ned. I've actually had a chance to listen to several of those and highly recommend them as well. So it's great to have you back, Ned. Appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
It's a pleasure, Doc, as always, and I look forward to speaking to you again at some point in the near future.